Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the EU External Action Against Deforestation. We have had a session this morning and we will have a session this afternoon. Both are organized by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES, and the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance, ASERG. And this morning we had the pleasure to listen to and interact with EU and Dutch policymakers, NGO activists and independent analysts who reflected on specific policy options and whether they could offer a way forward within the complex issue of deforestation. And this afternoon, we will discuss different potential policy options and initiatives. And we will discuss this in a panel of 4 excellent speakers, 4 academics from the University of Amsterdam, and they will reflect on the value and potential shortcoming of these initiatives. So let me start by introducing myself, Christina Eckes. I'm chairing this session, and we will have, as I said, 4 expert speakers, and they will all have 10 minutes for presenting their views. Then we will have a 3-minute interaction between the speakers, potentially reacting to each other, maybe already addressing some questions, we will see. And during the whole time, I encourage you to type any questions that you may have into the question and answer window that you will find on the bottom of your screen. And so we will be able to pick up these questions. Either I ask them to the speakers or they will be immediately typing an answer to you. Let me start by now introducing the speakers to you. Jonathan Zeitlin, a distinguished faculty professor of public policy and governance, and he published widely on the EU's forest law enforcement, governance and trade. So he will be the first addressing you. After that, Philipp Schleifer, assistant professor of transnational governance. Amongst others, he has written on the political economy of natural resources in the Global South. And Laurens Ankersmit, assistant professor of EU law, and he has written on green trade, fair trade in and within the EU. And finally, Maria Weimer, associate professor of EU law, and she has written in particular on risk regulation in the EU and in the internal market. And at present, she's carrying out a project that also looks to the interaction with the Global South. So without much further ado, I invite Jonathan Zeitlin to take the floor or take the Zoom screen and start his presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Christina. So let me first share my screen. And let's see if I can go backwards. Oops. Sorry about that. So my topic for today is what can EU external action against deforestation learn from FLEGT? FLEGT stands for the EU's Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Initiative. I've been studying FLEGT and what I call the emergent transnational timber legality regime for much of the past decades, and there's a lot that I would like to tell you about, but since we only have 10 minutes each, I want to focus on the essential conclusions and implications of my research for the debate about EU action against deforestation. So just a word about FLEGT, which you heard a little bit about, those of you who were participated in this morning's panel. The EU FLEGT action plan was launched in 2003. Its goals were to improve forest governance in developing countries and to combat trade in illegally harvested wood products. And it had 2 main wings. There are other elements, but these are the 2 essential ones. The first is negotiating voluntary partnership agreements, or VPAs, with producer countries in order to promote sustainable forest governance and assure export of legal timber. There are 9 such agreements to date and 6 more under negotiation. The second key component is enacting legislation, so-called EU timber regulation or EUTR, which prohibits firms from placing illegal wood on the EU market and obliges them to demonstrate due diligence that they have not done so. Okay, so I want to give you a set of what I see as policy lessons from the experience of FLEGT for EU external action against deforestation. The first lesson is that we need both supply and demand side measures. So effective EU action against deforestation will require a combination of supply side measures, that is aimed at producer countries, and demand side measures, which are aimed at companies importing into the EU market. And why is that? Well, supply side measures, particularly VPAs, but we heard this morning about other possible initiatives, partnership initiatives with developing countries, enhance both effectiveness and legitimacy by agreeing rather than imposing goals while adapting them to local conditions. They're also important for mobilizing domestic support for policy reforms and legal enforcement, and for tapping into local knowledge and mitigating possible negative impacts, for example, on small and medium-sized firms or local communities, which might not be anticipated. And so these kinds of partnerships are to be preferred whenever possible, but they need to be complemented by demand side measures. That is, in particular, due diligence regulations for access to the EU market. These are needed to incentivize producer countries to negotiate VPAs and to serve as a backdrop against trade diversion for those who won't negotiate such agreements. Think today about Bolsonaro's Brazil. They're also important to push transnational firms and traders to minimize the risks of illegal and unsustainable sourcing. And in this respect, we can think of them as constituting what governance theorists call a penalty default, which presses third country actors to collaborate in tackling the problem, in this case, of illegal logging. Second set of lessons concerning voluntary partnership agreements. And here, a lot of what I'm going to say dovetails with, echoes what several of the speakers this morning said, especially Duncan Brack and Saskia Ozeka. So I think there are 4 essential points that we've learned from studying VPAs, which are important. The first is the centrality of a multi-stakeholder deliberative process, which involves domestic civil society, as well as government and private business. And that's important in all stages of the negotiation and implementation of these agreements. So we need deliberation, not just consultation, and we need the involvement of non-state actors in implementation and monitoring, as well as negotiation. It's worth pointing out that in this process, it's important to assure a voice for weak actors who may be affected by the agreement, such as local forest communities and small and medium-sized enterprises. Secondly, at the core of VPAs are not only agreements on their goals, but also a system of traceability, transparency, and independent monitoring. VPAs involve an export licensing scheme, and these schemes need to be based on transparent and independently monitored traceability systems in order to ensure that the outputs, the licensed products, conform with agreed standards. And civil society involvement in that independent monitoring is likewise crucial. Thirdly, these systems are very difficult to build. They need capacitating support from the EU, both for public actors, government, in the case of timber, forestry, regulatory authorities, but also private actors. And that, again, is particularly civil society, but can also be business associations, community groups, or small and medium-sized enterprises. Fourthly, and this is something I've studied myself extensively, joint oversight by committees of national and EU representatives. And these, in the countries where VPAs are well advanced, like Indonesia and Ghana, have served as platforms for recursive review. So you review implementation and you figure out what still needs to be done. They're platforms for accountability in which non-state actors can draw attention to breaches and the EU can advocate with national governments to address them. And finally, they're platforms for collaborative problem solving. And one point I want to underline, which I think is very important, it came up also in this morning's discussion, is that negotiating and implementing voluntary partnership agreements has proved arduous and slow. And I think this is not because it's an ineffective or inefficient process and method, but rather because the problems that these agreements address are quite complex. Saskia talked this morning about wicked problems, and they're highly politically sensitive. So they deal with issues of land tenure, of property rights, of inequality, of corruption, and other possible approaches to cooperation with developing countries won't make those problems less difficult to deal with, and they won't make the problems necessarily go away. My final points concern due diligence regulations, and these rightly are at the center of the policy discussion on how to deal with deforestation. And so here, again, I'd like to make 5 points. First of all, that ensuring that the corporate use of due diligence systems, the idea that companies have the systems and they use them systematically, that is easier and more enforceable than prohibitions on illegal imports per se, even if the latter may have a deterrent value as they do in the EU timber regulation. Secondly, and this is quite an important policy issue for the EU, is that the due diligence obligation should extend beyond the first placement on the EU market to all operators handling forest risk commodities. And this is a loophole in the EUTR that I hope will be closed in the current review, but it will be very important for all forest risk commodities. Thirdly, assessing the risks of illegal or unsustainable sourcing requires high levels of both commodity-specific expertise and local knowledge about production and regulation in producer countries. This makes me a little skeptical about the generic forms of due diligence regulation that are being proposed as regards human rights, but it makes me more optimistic about commodity-specific forms that are being proposed. Fourthly, enforcement demands intensive collaboration between national competent authorities and transnational NGOs, both within and beyond the EU. So in the EU, we need an authoritative network of autonomous, well-resourced national competent authorities. It's important that the obligation for those authorities to investigate substantiated concerns of illegality submitted by third parties, carry over into EU action against deforestation. And in both cases, we can build on the positive experience of the Commission's EUTR flagged expert group, which I've written about, and the so-called timber regulation enforcement exchange network, which extends beyond the EU to competent authorities and NGOs in other consumer countries. And finally, here too, I want to draw attention to some challenges. And it's particularly difficult to ensure that member state penalties for violations are mutually consistent, as well as effective, dissuasive, and proportionate, given the EU's limited authority in this field. But that is a feature of the treaties that assign competences in this area to the member states, and it's simply something that the EU and the member states have to work on, and we need to be aware that making these due diligence systems work will be challenging as well as rewarding. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
So I will, I'm the next speaker, and I will take over from Jonathan. It's really a pleasure to participate in this panel and this discussion. In my remarks, I would like to pick up on some of the topics and questions that came out during the morning panel, and in particular drawing on my existing research on sustainability governance and the palm oil and soy sectors. I would like to reflect on how global market shifts in these industries can pose a challenge to EU external action on deforestation. And I also would like to offer some forward-looking reflections on possible ways to strengthen sustainability governance in these sectors. And in preparing for this panel, I came across a figure that was mentioned in multiple policy documents. And according to this figure, the EU is responsible for 10% of global deforestation that is embodied in final consumption, and even 36% of all traded deforestation that is contained in crops and livestock products. And I looked this up, and this figure actually comes from a study that was commissioned by the European Commission, and this study covers the time period between 1990 and 2008. So this data is over 10 years old, and I think it's important to note that these figures do not accurately reflect the current market situation anymore, and the trade flows in many forest risk commodity sectors have shifted rather strongly over the past decade. And I think it's important to acknowledge the implications of this for, on the one hand, the EU's deforestation impact, but also the European Union's ability to provide external governance in these forest risk commodity sectors. I just want to give you one example from the trade in soy, which is, as we all know, one of the major forest risk commodities in Brazil. And this is data that comes from the supply chain transparency platform Trace. And according to Trace, in 2008, the European Union imported about 19 million tons of soy from Brazil. And at that time, Chinese imports amounted to about 12 million tons. And 10 years later, in 2018, EU imports had dropped actually quite significantly to 13 million tons, whereas China's imports had increased to a staggering 68 million tons. And the same year in 2018, the total deforestation risk associated with China's Brazilian soy imports was 5 times as high as that of the European Union. And this is perhaps one of the more extreme examples, but also in other major forest risk commodity sectors, we see that emerging economies and often also the producer countries themselves really account for a growing proportion of trade and final consumption of these commodities. And against this background, I think it's really important to consider what the implications of these market shifts are for the potential of EU external action in these industries. And I noticed that in the policy discussion, these trends are often only mentioned at the margins, and I think they really should be much more central to strategic thinking about the choice and design of policy instruments. In particular, because the current proposals that are on the table often assume that EU market access and trade incentives are key to get actors in producer countries to enter into, let's say, bilateral agreements or to adopt voluntary sustainability standards, or to enter into multi-stakeholder processes about legality and legality verification. But I think the accuracy of this assumption and the usability to really provide strong incentives, this really needs to be critically scrutinized on a sector by sector and also on a country by country basis. And now, looking more concretely at the proposals that are on the table at the moment, as we hear this morning, there's political momentum building up behind, in particular, unilateral demand-side actions by the European Union, and this is likely to take the form of mandatory due diligence regulation. And in general, I think this is a positive development. Such regulation, if it is designed well, would be an important complement to the existing approach, which is really mainly based on voluntary commitments and certification schemes. At the same time, I believe that the potential effectiveness of these unilateral demand-side actions to really address commodity-driven deforestation is quite limited, and in particular in forest risk commodity sectors in which the EU's market power is diminishing, and in which also EU consumption plays less of a role in future deforestation. And in light of this, I really agree with many of the speakers, also from the morning panel, that a smart mix of instruments is needed, and that demand-side measures really need to be accompanied by also putting more emphasis on supply-side measures, such as just explained by Jonathan in his presentation, but also on international cooperation. So in concluding my remarks and also taking up some of the ideas that we heard this morning, I would like to offer a few forward-looking reflections on how the EU could support supply-side action, but also promote international cooperation on fighting commodity-driven deforestation. So my first point concerns ways to strengthen domestic governance in producer countries, and here I'm not so optimistic about the prospect of negotiating bilateral agreements with producer country governments. So, for example, agreements similar to the voluntary program agreements that we have seen in the timber sector. In particular, when we look at, for instance, palm oil, soy, but also, of course, the beef sector, which collectively have the largest deforestation impact, my fear is that the political economy conditions in the major producer countries are not very favorable for striking such agreements. But this does not mean that collaboration with state actors in these countries is not possible on other levels. For example, in both Brazil but also in Indonesia, we see that many subnational governments have taken promising actions to develop low carbon rural development strategies. One promising initiative, for instance, is the PCI, the Produce, Conserve, and Include strategy of the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil. And I believe that these jurisdictional programs that we see emerging right now in many subnational jurisdictions in tropical forest regions would really benefit from additional EU support. Hugo Shelley from the European Commission this morning was not so optimistic about using development assistance, but I'm wondering if it is used in a targeted way to support existing initiatives that have local ownership and that show potential, but in these cases, actually providing development assistance could not be a useful tool to strengthen supply-side governance in the producer countries. The second point I wanted to make concerns the role of free trade agreements, and this also came briefly in the morning panel. And here I'm wondering whether the comprehensive trade agreements that are currently being negotiated with Mercosur, but also with Indonesia, could be used by the EU to promote progressive policies on deforestation in these countries. And there's some of this going on already. It was just in the news recently that France and Austria, for instance, have made the ratification of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement conditional on Brazil taking action on deforestation in the Amazon. But at the moment, this seems to be rather ad hoc in nature. I'm wondering whether the sustainability chapters of these trade agreements are going to be used more strategically to this effect. But I'm also not a trade expert, and I know that Lawrence, in a previous conversation we had, was not so optimistic about using trade agreements as an instrument to promote sustainability in this way. So I would be keen to hear his thoughts on this particular point. My final point is that there are also new opportunities for international cooperation opening up. In recent years, we have seen that major emerging economies have adopted also more progressive sustainability policies. And here, I'm in particular thinking about China and its ecological civilization policy framework, which also includes provisions for green supply chains and green public procurement as well. I'm not entirely sure how far developed and implemented these policies are, but there is some indicative evidence that Chinese companies are already responding to a changing public policy context. So, for example, last year, COFCO, the large Chinese state-owned commodity trader, came out with a very strong no deforestation commitment at the World Economic Forum, and I think this is a promising development and create potentially opportunities for the EU to engage in international cooperation with other major demand-side jurisdictions on these issues. And this was also one of the pathways that was suggested by Hugo Shelley this morning from the Commission. I think it's a pathway that is really worthwhile pursuing. And I close here and stop my remarks here. Thank you.
Many thanks, Philip. Also, many thanks to Jonathan. I think both of you have left us with some doubts of how they work, the voluntary partnership agreements, or at least that they're very difficult to negotiate, and also that we have potential incoherences between member states' violation penalties. And Philip, you have shed some doubts on the power of the EU's market access and trade effect of getting third countries to buy into the schemes. You said you place your hope on free trade agreements, and I'm sure Laurens Ankersmit, who is our next speaker, will shatter that hope for us. So, Laurens, please take the Zoom screen.
Yes, thank you, Christina. I'm just going to share my screen. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this excellent event. I was going to speak about regulatory chill in the context of WTO law. But since Philip already invited me to say something about TSD chapters, I thought maybe I will start with a few remarks on why I'm a bit skeptical about the potential of TSD chapters in FTAs to address deforestation issues arising out of demand for these types of products. I think Mr. Shally said it quite aptly this morning when he spoke about these TSD commitments in the Mercosur deal, as to when he said that we shouldn't be overselling the TSD chapters as a means of addressing deforestation. And I think that's right. I mean, whenever when you actually read these TSD chapters, the joke among NGOs, I used to work for Client Earth, so we used to joke about TSD chapters as finding them very encouraging, in the sense that the wording of these chapters is that they encourage bilateral collaboration, bilateral dialogue. And that's actually also what Mr. Shally said this morning. So the wording of these chapters is already quite weak. On top of that, and I'll say a bit more about that, they are, let's say, quite difficult to actually enforce, but I'll come to that in a second. And I think third of all, maybe this is the more important argument that I would put forward, being skeptical about the use of TSD chapters in to address these issues, is that, in my view, they are more curing symptoms than actually addressing the underlying cause of deforestation. And these FTAs, they operate these TSD chapters, they operate in a bigger context. They are part of a bigger project, and that is the free trade agreement itself. And the free trade agreement itself is, of course, structured in a way, that benefits certain interests over others, and is, let's say, more based on how the GATT was set up originally. So it's not necessarily, it's not an environmental agreement. It's an agreement that in the end is there to secure a stable business environment for transnational corporations. And therefore, I don't think it's very suitable in that sense to look there for a way to address deforestation. And I actually have more faith in demand side measures, and also in bilateral and even multilateral efforts that are undertaken in a more environmental context. So I would place more faith in negotiating effective either VPAs, which are, well, okay, a bit more trade related agreements, but more agreements that are negotiated by, let's say, in an environmental legal context than in a trade context. I've already spent quite a few minutes discussing this. I wanted to speak a bit more about regulatory chill and how WTO law may or may not impact the effectiveness of demand side measures. And this always surfaces in discussions whenever the EU in particular embarks upon, let's say, a new journey to adopt legislation that would address the extraterritorial effects of free trade by adopting certain environmental measures. And we've seen that most recently when the government of Indonesia sought to challenge the implementation of the sustainability criteria in the EU's biofuels rules. So what I wanted to talk about, and I'll cut short a little bit the discussion here, is what kind of chilling effects does can the WTO cause? So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the dispute settlement system in the WTO context, because what you see when it comes to WTO law, that there is quite an eagerness to comply with WTO law without actually having an understanding of what what it is that the dispute settlement body does. So I wanted to spend a few words on that. On dispute settlement under the WTO. So obviously it's in the end the WTO Dispute Settlement body that decides whether or not any initiative enacted by the EU is in compliance with WTO law. But it's also quite important here to stress what the WTO system cannot do. So the WTO Dispute Settlement body cannot invalidate EU law. It cannot, it's a non-punitive system, so it cannot, let's say, punish in any shape or form the EU for not complying with WTO law. It can, the only thing that can ultimately happen within the dispute settlement system is that the party bringing the complaint is authorized to suspend some of its concessions because of the nullification and impairment of the economic benefits that that member had under the WTO agreement. So it's very much an economic rationale that underlies the WTO's dispute settlement system. So even if the EU would be not in compliance with WTO law, that would require, first of all, a finding of the WTO's dispute settlement body, and then that dispute settlement body will make recommendations to the EU how to come into compliance. And only when that doesn't work out, when the EU remains in non-compliance, then the dispute settlement body can, in the end, authorize the other party that is bringing the complaint to suspend some of its concessions that it has made to the EU. So it's very much based on whether an economic benefit to a WTO member is denied by the EU. So that's why this whole system is also, I would say, let's say it's a bit of a partisan system in the sense that the WTO really only works for industry that is negatively affected by certain measures by WTO members that they do business with. Well, in the interest of time, I will move on. I'll say one more thing about how that works within the context of the EU FTAs. Well, it's basically the same system, only then there is no appeal system, which means that basically you only have panel rulings that can result ultimately in the suspension of tariff concessions, for instance. So that obviously, that's what I wanted to say when it comes to TSD commitments. You cannot have that particular system for TSD commitments. So there's a lot of discussion, and I also saw it in the European Parliament's resolution that they want to reinforce the enforcement mechanism, that the specific enforcement mechanism that you have within the TSD chapter. It's very difficult to use the actual same system that you have under the WTO system, because if another member violates its environmental commitments, for instance, there's not necessarily a nullification and impairment of the economic benefits accrued under the agreement. That's not what the TSD chapter is about. So you have to, if you want to work with retaliation or penalties, you really have to have, in relation to the TSD chapter, a more punitive system whereby the panel that would find a member not in compliance with these TSD commitments to allow for the imposition of penalties. And that is kind of what the US has in some of its bilateral trade agreements, for instance, with Peru. So I wanted to say a few words on the current situation with the WTO. The WTO is in a kind of crisis. Many of you might have picked this up in the news. The U.S. Trade Representative, Mr. Lighthizer, has decided, or the U.S. government has decided, to no longer agree to the appointment of new members in the WTO's appellate body, which means that body is currently not effective. And why does the US do this? Well, the reason is that specifically Mr. Lighthizer wants to go to kind of like the pre-GATT or the pre-WTO times, where there was a more diplomatic way in which disputes would be resolved, and where, let's say, you would have a less judicial a less judicial way of resolving trade disputes, and which would also allow these parties to have a veto over panel rulings. And that's actually effectively what this has resulted into, because now WTO members, when there is a panel ruling that they don't agree with, they can simply appeal that panel ruling, and thereby that ruling goes into the void, as it's called. And that means you have a de facto veto over whatever a panel has decided. And that is quite interesting that this is currently the case, because that means that all the WTO members that are not signing up to this Commission initiative for a multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement are, when they have a dispute with the EU, there is this option of going into the void, basically vetoing any panel ruling. So that might also happen to, for instance, that dispute between the EU and Indonesia. If the EU simply doesn't like that ruling, well, the EU has the option, I'm not sure the Commission would ever do it, but would have the option to go into the void. And it's particularly relevant, I think, for these trade and environment disputes, because there you see that most of I think all of these cases always get appealed. So the fact that there's no appellate body here is quite relevant. Brazil has signed up to this new system. So if a dispute would arise out of this deforestation rules that the EU might or may not introduce in the future, the EU and Brazil could make use of this MPIA, but Indonesia and Malaysia might also join that system later on. But yeah, as it currently stands, there is the option for the EU if there is an unfavorable panel ruling in the Indonesia context to simply just de facto veto it. I think I've spoken for more than 10 minutes, so I'll leave it there and leave the rest for the discussion in a minute.
Many thanks, Laurens. Would you stop sharing your screen, please? Many thanks also for answering the question that was actually slightly next to your talk, so addressing the trade and sustainable development chapters in trade agreements for us and explaining to us to an extent where the limitations are. We will get back to the regulatory chill also in the questions. Let me encourage you, please, to type your questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We have some participants very active addressing us with questions. Please, if you have any doubts, any wish for any additional explanation, don't hesitate. And without much further ado, I will ask Maria Weimer to take over the Zoom screen and introduce, to give her introduction of 10 minutes. And after that, we will return to all the panelists. Please go ahead.
Thanks, just a second. Can you now see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I'd like to follow up on the previous speakers by offering a normative perspective on this discussion, and that is by exploring the question the question of whether EU regulation in the field of deforestation, or the question of how EU regulation in the field of deforestation is and should be normatively justified. And I will argue that this question is not purely theoretical, but actually matters for the success of EU efforts in this field. Right. So 20 years ago, the US legal scholar Daniel Bodansky has written an article with the title, "What's so bad about unilateral action to protect the environment?" And I'd like to put it more positively in this presentation by asking, what justifies the right of the EU to act as an environmental unilateralist? In other words, as a regulator that uses its market power combined with unilateral regulation to achieve global environmental goals, and that uses a system of carrots and sticks to regulate conduct abroad, thereby intending to have extraterritorial reach and impact. And so the basic assumption of my argument is that this new role of the EU as an environmental regulator for the entire world is a new type of EU transnational power that requires a new type of normative justification. After all, when regulating forest risk commodities, the EU aims to reshape entire global value chains and to change production practices in third countries, mostly in the developing world. Deforestation, as Saskia Ozinger explained this morning, is a wicked problem, deeply rooted in social and economic conditions in these countries, involving value and interest conflicts among different stakeholders. In other words, EU regulation will affect actors far beyond its jurisdiction, and that is precisely the idea. It can then be argued that the EU should justify its actions not only vis-à-vis its own citizens, but also vis-à-vis affected third country actors. And the idea is not to question the EU's democratic right to regulate, but rather to ask how that right could be reconciled with the need to also pay due regard to the interests and concerns of affected outsiders, particularly economically and socially vulnerable communities in developing countries. The claim that the EU owes justification to third country actors and that it must act in other regarding ways has its foundations in ethical demands for global justice. And I'm here referring to the work of, for instance, the philosopher Rainer Forst, but also to work of by legal scholars, for example, Eyal Benvenisti, who have written about these questions. But we can also find support for this claim in legal norms, both at the EU and at the international level. For the sake of time, I will focus here on the relevant provisions of EU law, namely the treaty provisions on EU external action, but also action in the field of environmental protection and development cooperation, which I believe support this normative view for mainly two reasons. The first reason is inherent in the Union's self-understanding as a normative power, a term coined by Ian Manners, an international relations scholar. And this idea is also reflected in the EU treaty provisions that you can see on this slide. Importantly, the EU understands its external action as being based on values and principles. And that means that its power as an international actor results from the power of its ideas and their persuasiveness and the persuasiveness of its values and principles to others. That implies that it is important for the EU that its action is justifiable towards outside actors, whom the EU ultimately wants to lead, in the case of deforestation, towards different stakeholders in the producer countries, for example. This also means that we can use these values and principles in the treaty to evaluate EU external action from an external perspective and to critique it where necessary. The second reason why these provisions can be seen as supporting the normative argument that I'm presenting here is that if we look at them and their language, they are at least open to an interpretation that the EU does owe a duty of care towards third country actors, particularly in the context of relations with developing countries. As we can see from these provisions, the EU is committed to sustainable development, fair trade, the protection of human rights, and it shall foster the sustainable, social, and environmental development of developing countries, with the primary aim of eradicating poverty. So these provisions also show that the EU's value-based system of external action is not hegemonic in the sense of imposing values on others, but it is one that strives to find cooperative solutions. It is concerned with issues of global justice, and it is one that respects international law. In fact, many of these values, for example, sustainable development, have been imported in the EU legal system from international law. By the way, we can also see this kind of commitments in EU policy documents, for example, in the Trade for All agenda that was developed under the former Trade Commissioner, Margaret Malmström. Of course, it must be noted that these treaty provisions on external action are open-ended and leave a lot of discretion on the part of the EU legislature. And thus, they are unlikely to serve directly as the basis for challenges to these measures before the Court of Justice. But they can inform the interpretation of other legal norms and procedures which might be relevant for third country actors. And this is what I'm turning to next. So what does my argument mean more concretely for the current EU discussion about the regulation of forest risk commodities? Now, I acknowledge that the argument developed here makes the EU's task even more difficult than it already is. Not only does the EU have to come up with an effective regulation to protect forests, but it also has to make sure that it is legitimate and justified in the eyes of third country actors, not to speak of its own citizens. However, I think or hope to have shown, and this also became clear from the discussion this morning, that the question of what works and how to achieve change on the ground is closely related to the EU's ability to persuade others to cooperate and to convince them to follow its lead. And that goes for both producer and consumer countries. Now, at present, if we look at the EU policy documents on deforestation, the dominant justification provided for EU regulation in this field is one that is related to the EU's own responsibility, so its complicity for creating demand for deforestation in the first place. Hugo Maria Shelley from the Commission's DG Environment this morning summed it up very nicely by saying that first and foremost, the EU has to bring its own house in order. I could not agree more. And a lot would be achieved by doing so. But it would not be in line with the EU's own values and principles to shift the burden of adjustment to its policy entirely to producer countries and to use its market power to extend its ideas about sustainability without involving those who carry the burden of such an adjustment and without giving them some form of voice, at least by way of taking impacts on them seriously. Unilateral action is justified by the urgency of the problem and by the EU's responsibility for creating it. But that does not mean that EU regulation should be guided by a unilateral mindset. So concretely, this means that the process of how future legislation is drafted and how it is implemented later is crucial and should provide for opportunities for third country stakeholders to voice their concerns and to be heard and listened to and responded to. For example, we can use the treaty provisions to interpret procedures for impact assessment and consultations that are currently taking place. and to make sure that third countries are included. Here, of course, there's a huge practical challenge of how to reach particularly weak parties, vulnerable and underrepresented groups who probably don't have the information or the capacity to reach out and show interest of being consulted by the Commission. And I think here we need a more proactive approach on the part of the Commission, as well as the help of civil society organizations. Also, reason giving and proportionality requirements should be interpreted as requiring engagement with third country impacts. Moreover, in the implementation of the future legislation on forests, it will be important to also interpret the principles of good administration in this slide. So, for example, principles of duty of care, transparency, and the right to be heard, and to make them work to third country actors insofar as they are affected by EU regulation. I also agree with Saskia Ozinga and Jonathan Zeitlin that partnership agreements should be at the heart of the EU framework on deforestation because of their deliberative and participatory nature, and thus their legitimating potential. This also would reflect the EU's commitment to multilateral solutions and international cooperation. And lastly, bringing its own house in order starts with action at home. And that has been mentioned also this morning already. It is really crucial for EU external action that it is not perceived as being a double standard, and that sustainability matters also in other EU policies, above all trade policy, this was discussed, but also internal policies such as the Common Agricultural Policy, a very problematic field in which we see that recent decisions did not give priority to strong sustainability commitments in EU agriculture, and also EU renewable energy, just to mention the most problematic cases. To conclude, I believe that acting in such ways would enable the EU to become a global leader for sustainability rather than just a unilateralist. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for also addressing the legitimacy issue head on. I'm sure we will have additional questions relating to that. But let me start by going back to Jonathan, to invite Jonathan Zeitlin to react to the other speakers to the extent that you wish, but also to address questions by the audience. And in relation to the audience, I think what connects closely to where Maria stopped is the question by Webe Duma, and that is, given that the EU timber regulation is hardly enforced in the EU member states, according to a WWF report from 2019, why would a producer country bother to commit a detailed and costly voluntary partnership agreement? And we have also a question that I will immediately throw it in the interest of time, by Echard Topper, and that is the idea that the EU's market leverage is quite limited in relation to commodities is not new. As part of the FLEGT action, so the Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Action, there have been initiatives to broaden the international support for timber legality legislation similar to the EU timber regulation. And for example, through the bilateral coordination mechanism with China. So the question is whether there have been studies carried on to what extent such initiatives have contributed to the broader international support for legal and sustainable timber, and what lessons could be learned. I think, Jonathan, you're well placed to address these questions and react to the other panelists.
Yeah, I think that I will focus on these new questions because I was also going to react a little bit to Philip's excellent talk. Maybe I just start with the market leverage issue. So, I mean, there's Duncan Brack pointed out this morning, there's quite a wide range of variation in terms of the forest risk commodities, how important the EU market is for them. So as he rightly said, the most promising commodity for a voluntary partnership agreement is undoubtedly cocoa in West Africa, where the EU accounts for 80% of the market and where there is substantial already expressed interest from government and from major chocolate producing multinationals, as well as from civil society in those countries. More generally, however, I would say, and this also includes timber, that even where the EU itself is not an overwhelmingly large market, its market is typically large and lucrative enough to create significant incentives for producer countries and exporting countries. And obviously, those incentives are reinforced where cooperation with other consumer countries is possible. And this is exactly, as Echer points out, what we see in the timber field, where timber legality regulation, that is requirements, public regulation of imports, which are designed to exclude and penalize timber which is harvested illegally in its place of origin, have been adopted by a growing range of countries, starting with the US, then the EU, but also extending to countries like Australia and South Korea, and in a certain measure, Canada and Japan as well. And here, the forms of cooperation among the enforcement authorities and also with NGOs are really crucial. And I've written about them in the paper that I posted a reference to on experimentalist interactions, joining up the transnational timber legality regime. But here I want also to make a link to the point raised by Maria, which is the question of legitimacy as being crucial. So in a sense, voluntary partnership agreements where developing countries themselves acknowledge the validity of the idea of excluding illegal timber from the EU or other markets, play a very important part also in winning cooperation and making it easier for other consumer countries to adopt the same standards and work together. And I think it's quite striking that indeed China has progressively endorsed this growing international norm against importing illegally logged wood, and also the possibility of using public restrictions against it. And indeed, the latest Chinese forest law explicitly addresses the question of illegal trade in illegal wood. And for a long time, there has been cooperation, for example, between the EU and China in trying to develop a Chinese legality verification scheme. We have to see whether that will eventually be implemented. And the implications of that are very strongly that this combination of legitimacy through justification, through cooperation with affected countries, and working together with other producer countries is the way forward also, I would say, for forest risk commodities. And finally, to come back to the question that is raised by Wiebe Dauma about enforcement of the EUTR, I think that actually, if you look closely, you will find that this enforcement has been progressively stepped up and improved since the regulation came into effect, particularly through the work of the EUTR flagged expert group. And we can show that this affects in a material way the calculations of importing firms and also of producers, exporters in third countries, such as China, which has really started to redirect its imports of wood away from the highest risk sources, not least because they have to deal with the public timber regulations in the EU and in other consumer countries. China is the biggest world exporter as well as importer of wood. I think I will stop there. Maybe there's some points to come back to later on.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think this leads us smoothly also to a question that I think was addressed to Philip Schleifer, and that is posed by Saskia Ozinga, and it also concerns China, namely the question whether the EU doesn't have to do more work, in the sense that the 2018 Trace Yearbook indicates that deforestation risk of soy imports is much higher for the EU than for China. And so the question is, doesn't it sound like there's more to do for the EU than seemed to come out of your final point of getting other demand side jurisdictions to the table? But Philip, maybe you want to clarify that.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Christina, and also thank you, Saskia, for the question. So I think it's true that in the past, the associated deforestation risk for EU imports of soy from Brazil was significantly higher than the Chinese one. But I think this actually is not the case anymore. So the data that I looked into came from the Trace Yearbook 2020, and I think there, from what I understood, is that the EU deforestation or the associated risk has been reduced. And then, of course, given the significantly higher volume of soy imports from China, it means also that the aggregate deforestation impact or aggregated deforestation risk is higher. But I did not want to kind of convey the idea that the EU does not matter for deforestation, and that therefore there is no need for action. So this was definitely not what I wanted to convey as an argument. But I feel that sometimes the significance of the EU as a trading power, but also as a contributor to the problem is somewhat exaggerated in the policy discussion, and this is what I wanted to bring out. But I also would like to quickly respond to Jonathan as well, and here I think when it comes to these bilateral trade agreements, it is really important to consider that there is significant variation on a commodity by commodity basis. And I think what is important here really is to do a sound analysis of the scope conditions on a commodity by commodity, and also on a country by country basis. And I think this is an important way to kind of gauge the feasibility of striking bilateral agreements with producer countries. And in addition to that, I think another important exercise is also to really try to learn from existing initiatives. And so basically, you really to do what Jonathan did in his presentation, but also what Saskia Ozinga did from Fern in her presentation this morning, to study existing supply side initiatives and also measures such as the VPAs, but also emerging jurisdictional initiatives, as well as regional moratoria such as the Amazon soil moratorium, for instance, and really see what works and what doesn't work, and to draw lessons on the basis of this, and then also to really propose better measures and ways to improve these instruments moving forward. And one thing I think that really should be clear here is that working to support these supply side measures will always have quite a long time horizon. So I think that there are no shortcuts here. And I think this does create a challenge for the sometimes more short-term and results-oriented orientation of policymakers. But in my mind, I think ultimately building stronger governance systems at the sites of production, where really the deforestation is happening, is ultimately the only way really to tackle this wicked problem of deforestation. And I think I stop here.
Many thanks, Philip, both for reacting and answering the question or addressing the question. I will ask a question to Laurens, and please also feel free, Laurens, to react to anything that you pick up from the other panelists. You already started your talk in doing so. And that is, you addressed the problems, let's say shortcomings, lack of enforcement, difficulties. And I was wondering, how could we strengthen that enforcement? And I think this relates very closely to one of the questions that was asked to us, or it's at least one specific avenue in which one could consider better enforcement mechanism, and that is by Myron Bastos Lima, and that is what potential do multilateral environmental agreements hold to allow the European Union to pursue its sustainability values more effectively? So is there something to gain in multilateralism as opposed to bilateral agreements? But also in relation to your presentation, where you mainly stressed the difficulties with enforcement, how could the trade and sustainable development chapters be better enforced? Do you have anything to add to that? Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I think I think I'll start just before I forget, just to respond to a comment Jonathan made in his presentation on enforcement, also enforcement, but then more on enforcement of the timber regulation. The problem being that member states are responsible for the implementation of the EU's timber regulation, and that this happens, let's say, on the basis of member state laws and member state enforcement mechanisms. And I would think, or I would suggest there, if you're looking at a more effective way of doing it, just from a perspective of EU law, it would be to adopt border measures, very plain and simple. So to have conditional import bans and make customs officials responsible for what comes in and what doesn't come in. That's a very effective way of regulating what is on the EU's internal market, just plain and simple border measures. So, and that of course can be combined with certification schemes, etc. And that's not how the timber regulation works, because it's more about imposing obligations on economic operators that operate on the EU's internal market. So to step after the importation stage, if you will. So what can we do in terms of the TSD chapters? Well, I personally would just not go that way. I would focus on demand side measures, and I would focus on unilateral measures. I mean, the world is literally on fire. We have 10 years to address climate change before it becomes irreversible. And I think it's really, really important to stop the buck here and to move. I mean, it can go in combination with bilateral talks and see how we can move things forward in the context of a multilateral environmental agreement or a bilateral environmental agreement. But I think really it's now quite urgent, like the time is now to actually take some action and to stop the bleeding. I mean, I think the perspective taken by also Maria is really, in my view, looking at the things the wrong way around. What is causing these extraterritorial effects is the fact that there is free trade. If there is no trade, there is no effect of these the EU's rules. So I would be inclined to say that given the urgency of the situation, I would and also the long period over which we already have tried to address this issue through VPAs, through the timber regulation, and it has not resulted in the results that we were hoping for. So I think that we need to step up our efforts and reverse, so to speak, the sequencing. So first unilateral measures, and then open up to bilateral discussions, instead of having international discussions first that lead to nothing, and then maybe adopting unilateral measures, because clearly we don't have the time for that, I think.
Many thanks, Laurens, also in throwing in this quite controversial point, telling Maria that she is looking at this the wrong way around. I'm sure, Maria, you're happy that I'm giving you the word to also react to Laurens' comment in that regard. And I would like to add a question from the audience, and that is from Indra van Gisbergen, who was also a speaker this morning, also from Föhn. She asks, what could the European Commission do more in terms of forest diplomacy? And I would also like to ask a question that I rather want to hear your reflection on, and that is, you mentioned the double standards, and it's something that also occupies me a lot. I was trying to also ask a question on that this morning. But on the other hand, to what extent can you address it all at the same time? I mean, the things you're mentioning, the common agricultural policy reform, the energy reform, you're mentioning several very core issues that are all very important, but of course the point cannot be the European Union has to first get all this in order before it can do anything about deforestation elsewhere. That cannot be your point, I assume. Maria.
Thanks, Christina, for asking and answering the question. No, seriously. Okay, so I'll thanks for the questions and comments, and especially for the provoking ones. Perhaps I will start then with Laurens, because it was directed at my argument, and I think. So first of all, my argument was not against unilateralism. I hope this didn't come across in that way. I do think that unilateral action is legitimate and justified by the urgency of the problem. That is what I said. I do, however, think that simply because problems are urgent, and everybody, the European Union thinks that it wants to see change, that doesn't mean that change will occur just because it uses its market power. It's not that simple, and we've heard that from people in the policy panel this morning. And it's not that simple because, as Saskia Zingas said, we need systemic, long-lasting change, and that cannot be achieved without legitimacy and acceptance on the ground. So it is a bit of wishful thinking. And I'm all in favor of using unilateral measures, but I'm emphasizing that if they are to be successful and if they are to produce change, they need to engage with the question of legitimacy, and there's no way around that. There was, by the way, a question about the EU's imperial past in the Q&A, and I think that reinforces this point, that it actually reinforces the argument that because of that past, the EU has to be particularly sensitive to to acting in a unilateral way and simply sort of wielding its market power and leaving the burden of adjustment to everybody else. I also would like to comment briefly on the issue of the WTO and regulatory chill, because I just would like to, I think, add something that Lawrence didn't really go into, and that is that the last 15 to 20 years of WTO jurisprudence have actually shown that the WTO law is not an obstacle to unilateral environmental regulation. And the EU basically got away with everything it wanted to get away with under WTO law. I think that there is another way, particularly from the perspective of the argument that I'm trying to make about the sensitivity and the need to pay due regard to concerns of the external impacts of EU regulation. We can actually interpret, and it has been interpreted in this way, we can interpret WTO law as imposing obligations of justification on its members that can be described as other regarding. So US shrimp is still the leading case in this regard, and it has formulated obligations for domestic regulation to be flexible, to respect due process rights for foreign stakeholders, to respect local conditions in third countries, etc. Now, the US regulation in this case was not found to be in violation because it was environmental unilateral regulation, but because it was a rigid and unbending standard that was found to be coercive in that way. Now, we have to be critical about trade regimes and their ability to address environmental problems. I agree with that. I simply think that in this world, which is not an ideal one, we have to work with the instruments that are out there, and there is a power in providing counter narratives and counter interpretations, and sort of try to critically review the instruments that are at our disposal. And I think WTO and trade agreements are these kind of instruments. I think that probably your criticism of the sustainability chapters and trade agreements is very much focused on their current form, which nobody argues is a very effective way of addressing environmental issues. But I think what we need to think about is how to reform them, in fact. And you know, I'm not an expert in this field, but again, this is a possibility of engaging with countries that would otherwise not engage. And we need to look for, as Philip said, you know, we need to explore different ways of engagement, and everything has to be part of the mix, particularly given the urgency of the situation. Yeah, on Indra's question, it is a bit related to what I just said. I think that Philip or Jonathan would be better placed to answer it because they have done a lot of empirical research in this field. But again, I think that forest diplomacy, the EU should use all means at its disposal, including development cooperation, including the attempt at international cooperation, multilateral agreements, multilateral environmental agreements, and unilateral regulation coupled with partnership. Everything that's out there must be used for forest diplomacy. The question of multilateral environmental agreements, I think, is a difficult one. Again, it's a bit of, sure, it would be better, but given that there's not much hope that such agreements could be negotiated at present. Again, this justifies the need for unilateral action. Christina, the double standard, no, I agree with you. The conclusion is not to say that the EU has to fix everything internally, but the conclusion is that the EU should take a critical look at itself. And again, it reinforces the question of being responsible vis-à-vis other third country stakeholders, vulnerable groups who are not represented in EU decision-making, at least not strongly. And yes, no, I wouldn't want to wait until we have a successful reform of the agricultural policy in the EU, but I just wanted, this is just, a call for a critical look at these issues when the EU is wielding its market power across the globe.
Thank you, Maria. We have 3 more pressing questions from the audience, and I will prioritize those, seeing that we have only 6 minutes left. So let me put them together. They are addressed to several panelists, and then I invite the panelists to simply take the floor and address them if they feel called. The first one is by Geraldo Vidigal, and that is, without serious multilateral action, isn't there a problem that the EU's unilateral action could lead to pockets of premium sustainable production of goods for the EU market, while production of non-sustainable products continues elsewhere? So if the aim is really to stop production, don't we need multilateralism? It won't happen the unilateral way. That's pretty much the question. The other question is by David Andrew Wardell, and this is that we have so far neglected temporal scales. The question here is, what do we regard as the starting point of the EU's or the member states' complicity in illegal tropical deforestation and extraction of other resources? The power of the EU's or member states' ideas, values, principles, and interests have deep, or not very flattering, colonial roots. I think this is also a question up there for grabs. And finally, Enrico Patiti asks, would also integrated landscape management initiatives require embedding in a bilateral partnership agreement? And I believe that maybe Laurens would like to get back at the trade and sustainable development chapter, but maybe we park this for the end and first address the audience questions. Please simply turn on your camera and grab one, or I will point at someone.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in, Christina. I'd like to take up Geraldo's question, which is a good one. I think the point here is that we need to think about how, we've talked particularly about how unilateral and bilateral measures fit together, but we also need to think in terms of how they can encourage a plurilateral approach. I mean, here, maybe it's useful also to take up the multilateral issue. And here, I'm just, from the experience of studying, international forest governance, I'm pretty skeptical about the likelihood for effective multilateral action. I mean, the problems of consensus or unanimity requirements, the limited role of non-state actors in the process have made things like the UN Forum on Forests or also Forest Europe, which has been negotiating for a long time over a possible legally binding instrument on all types of forests. They've made them relatively ineffective. The action in the past 20 years has really come from initiatives like FLEGT, like the EU Timber Regulation, like the Lacey Act in the United States, and the cascade of public legality regulations around the world that I talked about earlier. I would say, however, that what the EU can do is help to trigger this kind of plurilateral action. And it can do it first by acting unilaterally, but second, by acting bilaterally and getting the buy-in and the legitimation from cooperation with the producer countries, which is a key element in extending the demand side regulations beyond the EU market alone. Let me make one other comment, and this is about how trade and trade agreements link into this whole process. And first of all, we should remember that the voluntary partnership agreements are legally binding trade agreements. They're a good example of how trade can be used to foster progressive environmental and social goals. But there is also an interaction with other kinds of trade negotiations. For example, Indonesia threatened to pull out a number of times from the VPA, or rather the Indonesian Ministry of Trade, which tends to operate as a kind of independent power, twice put forward regulations making the timber legality assurance system non-obligatory for some exporters. And in each case, they dropped these regulations for reasons connected with the broader negotiations with the EU on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. So that helps to overcome the conflicts between different sectoral interest groups and even different ministries in a country like Indonesia. If we're going to tackle palm oil effectively, then it seems pretty clear that Indonesia is going to have to be brought along, and palm oil not simply excluded from the EU market, because if that were the case, then as Geraldo suggests, the fact would be that it just gets sold in other markets, and that wouldn't help deforestation. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the question still out there is the one on the colonial roots of the EU's and member states' ideas, values, principles, and interests. And if no one volunteers, I think I will address the question to Maria.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Very good.
In a way, I already addressed that question in my previous intervention, but perhaps, so I acknowledge that criticism, and I also see how the treaty provisions which speak about the promotion of its values and interests in relations to the wider world are very, remind us of that kind of promotion of values in Europe's imperial past. And so, as I said, I think it reinforces the argument of being very mindful of how the EU is going about its unilateralism. But one thing that I would like to say is that what I think what gives me hope is that when looking at these provisions and the way that the EU formulates its values and principles in its external policy, in fact, by committing to these values of equality, human dignity, sustainable development, fairness, justice, to committing to these values in its external relations with the wider world, the EU can actually be held to account for living up to these expectations in its relations with third countries. In other words, it's extending these by extending these principles to its external relations, it actually allows us to argue that equality and fair trade would require giving more voice to affected actors abroad, etc. So it's in a way, it's and the way that these values are formulated ultimately, I think, are very mindful of a unilateral imposition of values, as I said, and therefore justifies understanding that not in a hegemonic imperial way, but more in a way of reaching out, cooperating, being a multilateral actor, etc. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. I acknowledge the criticism.
Many thanks. And I think I will give a last and very short word to Laurens to maybe react to the trade and sustainable development chapters, mindful of the fact that we are running over time.
Yeah, I'll be very short. I didn't want to respond on TSD. I just wanted to say that unilateral action doesn't mean that it's not inclusive or illegitimate. I think a unilateral action that actually involves indigenous communities, unilateral action at EU level that involves indigenous communities, that involves NGOs working in Brazil, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, is a much more inclusive and legitimate way of regulating than negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with Bolsonaro and the industrial interests that he represents. So I don't think it's that black and white. I think unilateral action can be inclusive and just as legitimate as bilateral and multilateral forms of regulation. It just depends on who you involve, who you speak to, and whose interests are reflected in the legislation that is adopted.
Christina, may I just say that I'm happy that actually Lawrence and I are on the same page on this one.
Very good.
Me too.
Even though discussion, of course, also lives from disagreement, I'm glad that this is a point that we can agree on. Many thanks to our panelists for this very interesting discussion. Many thanks to the audience for their questions, challenging, asking about our premises and our points. I can only conclude by wishing you a good evening and hopefully see you next time at the next panel discussion that ACES or ASAC organize.